So today we are going to be migrating, and I'm going to be taking you guys through my entire migration process, all the steps I go through, and how exactly I am planning and prepping for my 2022 bullet journal. So I have my bullet journal here. This is my 2021 bullet journal. So this guy will be finishing at the end of December. And for my 2022 bullet journal, I'm going to be planning my entire migration in this guide right here. This is essentially just a worksheet version of the migration process that I go through, and I wanted to make it this kind of fun printable guide that you guys can follow if you want to, because I know that the migration process can be a little confusing, and I thought, you know, maybe if you really like the way I do mine, then you could just print this out and do it for yourself, and then hopefully your migration will be really stress-free and enjoyable, which is what I hope for all of you. So I'm gonna be going through this today, and we are gonna be just getting ready for 2022. Now, before I dive into my migration guide, I would like to say that if you are just starting out with a bullet journal, I wouldn't recommend doing this guide. If you're just learning the system, I would instead scrap this. I would grab a notebook you own around the house and then just set up the bullet journal according to Ryder's video on YouTube, which is called How to Start a Bullet Journal. And then I would just simply use that system, the very basic bones, for 1 to 3 months. And then hopefully that will give you a good idea of how the system works, but also more importantly, allow you to know whether or not you actually want to use the system and if it'll work for you. So I just wanted to put that out there in case there are any true, I guess, beginners who have never used a bullet journal before. They don't know what an event signifier is, they don't know what collections are, and they have no idea what the basics are. I think it's really important to learn the basics before you get really technical and really, I guess, get customized with your bullet journal. And that is what I would recommend if you are new doing before going into this. Now, if you create a tester bullet journal, which is what I like to call like the notebook that you just find in your house and set up and test for 1 to 3 months, and you're going from your tester bujo to a actual notebook, and you want to figure out how to customize it from the kind of basic approach that Ryder uses and how to really make it your own, then you can dive into this guide with me and get working. But I don't want anyone who's completely new doing like all these prompts and getting really overwhelmed, because I know when I was new, just learning what all the signifiers were and the symbols were was enough work for me and took a lot of mental effort to remember everything. So yeah, let's get into my migration process and this fun little guide, which I think I mentioned below, but I'll link it below in case you want to print it out and fill it out with me. So yeah, let's get into it. So the first thing I like to do when I migrate into a new journal is I like to review my old journal. And if you're completely new to bullet journaling and you're just moving from your test bujo to your first bullet journal, you can also review your old organization systems, your old mindfulness practices, maybe digital tools or productivity apps you've used. Essentially what I like to do and make sure I'm doing in this step is really getting a good idea of what has been working for me and what hasn't been working for me on a high level. Alright, so here we go. This is what I wrote down for the things generally that worked and didn't work this year in this bullet journal. So let me share my answers with you guys, because I feel like part of this migration process that I found so confusing was people would say, what works and what doesn't work in your journal? And you're like, okay, but like, what do you mean by that? So you guys are going to be seeing all my answers today, so I hope that gives you some clarity on that. So for me this year, I tried to write down things that worked and didn't work at a very high level. I didn't look specifically at spreads that worked and didn't work because I like to fill that out a bit later. Right now, I'm just trying to get really clear on overall what kind of functions and I guess intentions worked well in my journal. So starting with things that didn't work, this year I realized that just using my bullet journal as a productivity tool wasn't really the best thing, and it just wasn't really a way for me to use my bullet journal not only to its fullest, but in a way that made me most fulfilled. And I kind of explored this year new kind of functions and approaches to bullet journaling, and that's kind of in this worked section. So this year what really worked for me was adding more reflections, such as my monthly review and my weekly review, into my bullet journal. I found this gave me a lot more mental clarity and just allowed me to have a lot more intention when going through things I wanted to do in my daily life, as well as how I wanted to approach my bullet journal practice in a way that was, I guess, the most optimized for my life. Also, I incorporated a lot of like memory keeping and kind of, I guess, just documenting life memories through journaling, such as like my one-line day spread, as well as through photos. And these two kind of additional functions, reflecting and memory keeping, I found really brought my bullet journal to a whole new level that I didn't even know it could reach and just became so much more of a more satisfying and meaningful kind of tool that I am really excited to look back on. So those are the things that worked. The last thing that didn't work for me, and this is kind of unrelated to the other three guys, is this year I found that scheduling future events, so like dates and appointments and all that stuff, in my bullet journal just wasn't really the most effective way. And instead I found a new way to do that, which for me was through digital planning and my Google Calendar. All right. So that is step one out of the way, and this gives me a really good idea of just generally what was really kind of helpful in my journal and what was really like fulfilling and what really wasn't, and maybe, you know, with the didn't work column, some changes I want to make. And that's kind of that step out of the way. The next thing I like to do when migrating into a new journal is to define, or I guess re-clarify, your bullet journal's purpose. I like to answer a couple questions like, why do I want to use a bullet journal? How specifically is my bullet journal going to help me? And what is the big purpose of your journal? And what are some smaller or supportive purposes for your journal? Some examples of purposes that you can talk about and are in addition to the ones I'm writing down are productivity, mindfulness, memory keeping, tracking health, tracking maybe children, dogs, or partners' schedules, project management, creative expression, gratitude, and honestly, the list goes on, but those are a couple examples. All right. Let's bring you guys in a little bit. Perfect. Here is my kind of why or purpose mind map, I guess, for my bullet journal right now and my kind of purposes for my bullet journal. So I brainstormed 3 main purposes for my current journal and I guess my 2022 journal, and those are mindfulness, mental health, and documenting life. So starting with mindfulness, this is a big purpose for me because not only does my journal help with intentional living, which is important to me, but it also helps with productivity and kind of making sure that I am mindful with the things that are important to me and then doing them efficiently. So kind of mindfulness and productivity going hand in hand in that category. The next one is mental health. So for me, being organized is a really important strategy that I like to use for staying very calm and not being overwhelmed and not getting stressed out. And then the third thing and the third purpose of my journal is to document life and essentially allow it to be a tool to archive kind of life moments and memories and photos and all that good stuff. So I kept my whys pretty general, but you could break it down even more. So productivity, you could break down into like project management, and then you could have meetings and like staying on top of that and all that stuff. But I guess the point is why I like to break down my journal into the purposes before I get into figuring out spreads is I find if I have a really good idea of the intention or the purpose behind my journal, I can use those purposes as ways to really figure out what spreads are going to be the most important and the most helpful and the most meaningful in my journal. Alright, so now that I've figured out what worked and didn't work in my journal, and I've defined my journal's purpose, the last step that I like to do before really diving into the spreads and kind of the notebook and all of that fun stuff is creating boundaries for what information my journal is going to hold. I think this is probably one of the most important things to do, especially before creating spreads, because I have a tendency to want to make like every spread and put them all in my journal, which just leads to my setups being not only overly long, but having a lot of blank spreads at the end of the day because I probably didn't really need them in the first place. So I find this helps me figure out kind of what is most important for me to keep in my bullet journal, but also it kind of reminds me what stuff I don't really want to keep in my journal and is better not to keep in my journal. So for this step, I do a really simple exercise. I make a table and I write down information that I need to track in my life. I don't make like a fully comprehensive list, but I just try to get all the key ones. And then over here, I write down where all the information is going. So whether that's my bullet journal, or maybe my digital calendar, or any other tool that I have that stores information. So here is what my answers look like all filled out. On the left, I tried to write down most of the things I could remember that were kind of big pieces of information I need to record in my life. And based on this list, I kind of tried to section things off based on what I like to keep in my bullet journal or plan to keep in my bullet journal next year, and what stuff goes into other places, just so I'm not making spreads in my bullet journal later on that I should really be keeping in other things. And also I tried to select things for my bullet journal based on the purposes and intentions that I wrote down in step 2. So just making sure that everything I want to keep in my bullet journal is going in there because it makes sense and it's going to be valuable for me. So for my bullet journal this year, I plan to keep my events and my schedule, my birthdays and reminders, and these are going to be kept in my bullet journal a little differently than in my Google Calendar, since as you can see, these pieces of information do overlap. And I know it sounds a bit complicated, but it's really not. Pretty much the key difference here is my Google Calendar is future events, future birthdays, and future reminders. And my bullet journal is where I write all these things down from a memory keeping perspective. So while I don't plan out events, birthdays, and reminders, ahead of time, I do still like to write these things down in my journal in like my daily logs as well as my monthly highlights, just so that I have a good idea of what was going on in my life during that time. But it's not like I'm using my journal to plan out these things and schedule them ahead of time. That is what my Google Calendar is for. Outside of my, I guess more event-based things, I have my tasks and projects, which I keep in my journal, notes, things that I've watched, read, played, as well as habits. And then the last 3 items on my list here, personal thoughts, quotes, and book notes, are all kept in separate places. So my personal thoughts are in my personal journal, my quotes are in my commonplace book, and my book notes are in my reading journal. And I know it can be kind of confusing deciding which things you want to leave out of your bullet journal and figuring out how to make that decision. For me, the way I like to think about it is I think about, I believe, 3 things. The first thing I think about is this thing gonna take up a lot of space in my bullet journal and essentially force me to have to migrate into a new journal every like 2 months? This one applies to my personal journaling. I tend to write at least a page a day of personal thoughts. And if I did that in my bullet journal, in addition to recording all this stuff, I would probably need a new notebook every month. So because of that, I keep this separate. The second thing I think about is if I'm going to reference it a lot and if it's something that I need to view on the go. So for something like my book notes, I don't need to see these on the go. And this kind of goes into my third thing I like to think about, which is, would I prefer to keep this separate and compiled in one separate place? So while I could easily keep book notes in my bullet journal, I don't read that many books and take notes on them a year. I prefer to keep them separate because I just find it a lot easier to reference when they're all together. And also I just find for things like book notes where I'm not taking a ton of them every year, I would prefer not to have them dispersed over 4 different journals, because that would just make it a little harder to find specific notes on specific books, because I have to like go through 4 books and go through all their indexes. So for book notes and quotes, these are just things I find easier to keep separate and to keep together on their own. So that is why I like to keep these in their own books respectively. So I know it's a lot of like kind of background work before we even get into like spread brainstorming and figuring out the supplies, because I know I like that part the best too, but I do really find that steps 1 to 3 are super key for just kind of getting the intention set, which is honestly what I've found to be the biggest thing that can make or break my journal and make it either work really well for me or not work really well for me. So doing the reflection work at the beginning, while something I find tedious, is something that is super important. But we are now done that part, and now we can get into the fun. I love planning out spreads. Honestly, it's one of my favorite things and why I love getting ready for a new year with a new bullet journal. So I decided to create 2 different ways to plan out your spreads. And this is because I've done it 2 different ways, and it honestly just depends on the stage of my life and the level of patience I have and the amount of time I have during the process. But regardless of the approach I use, the next thing I do when going about my migration process is creating a setup game plan, and more specifically coming up with the spreads that I want to make in my journal. So if you're newer and you are just starting a bullet journal, I'd recommend just making a simple 2-column table like this. And on one side, you write down the core bullet journal spreads you want to set up. So things like the key, the index, the future log, the monthly log, and the daily log that are part of the original method. And then on the right-hand side, you can brainstorm spreads that you need to set up because they align with your purpose or your journal's intention. And then I also like to kind of allow this space to be a place where I can write down spreads that I just really want to try out because they look really cool. So this is one way I like to do it. This is really easy and simple, but if you want to get a little more elaborate and get a little more fancy, you can also do this. So this involves having a bullet journal beforehand, obviously, but essentially with that journal, you can divide up your spread list into 4 categories. spreads that you're keeping and migrating over from your old journal, spreads that you're adding into your journal that weren't previously a part of your old bullet journal, spreads that you kept in your old bullet journal but don't want to carry over, so you're just scrapping them entirely, and then spreads that you had in your old journal but you need to modify or change so that they work for you. And I do both of these ways. It just kind of depends on what I feel like doing at the moment. You know what? Okay. I'm gonna do this one just because I think it'll be easier. So I'm definitely gonna add my key. Let me bring you guys in. There we go. Yeah, so I'm definitely gonna add a key next year. So I'm gonna add that core spread. The index I'm not really sure about because I don't want to have to number all my pages in my new notebook, but I'm just gonna put a question mark for now. I'm not really sure. Future log, I'm going to use a future log as a way to backlog cool events that happened. It's not going to be like a planning tool because that will be my Google Calendar. I always keep my monthly log and I always love a good daily log. This is like the bread and butter of my bullet journal. In terms of other spreads I need, carrying over from my old bullet journal, I used my book spread a lot, so I'm going to bring that over because I really like having a record of all that stuff that I consumed at the beginning of my journal. So with that, I'll bring over my TV and movies watched, and then my video games that I played, even though most of the time I'm just replaying Breath of the Wild. I also want to bring over my one line a day spreads, which I've been really loving. And then one spread I want to add that I didn't have, but I kind of realized I would have liked was a like travel log to write down like hikes and stuff I did. Oh, and then kind of along those lines, I kind of want to do a like photo a month spread, and that will be fun too. So if I look at these spreads, all of these ones are kind of in alignment with my third purpose for my journal, which is documenting life. In terms of my other two purposes, I think those spreads will kind of go together, and that's going to be my project list. And then besides that, I find for like productivity and organization, the monthly log and monthly planning really carries into that. What I will do closer to the setup date, but I'm not going to bother doing now, is I will go through these spreads and write down how many pages I think I need for each of them. So like for example, I already know my project log, I will need 2 pages. So I'll just do like a 2 beside it like this here. So I'll mark down both the number of pages just to make my life easier. And then based on that, I will put the names of my spreads on little like sticky tabs and then put them on the pages of my notebook in the order I want to make them. So then I have kind of the order of how I want to do things figured out as well. After I come up with my list of spreads that I want to make in my journal, I then like to move on to step 5, which is gathering my notebook and other supplies. So buying a notebook can kind of be a big deal, especially if you're bullet journaling in it for like half or a full year. You want to make sure you pick something that is going to work for you. So I just wrote down here a couple things that I like to think about when deciding on a notebook. For me, the biggest thing I like to think about when deciding on a notebook is, well, I guess there's kind of 2 big things for me. The first thing is, does it have any things that are really gonna bug me? If you guys have been around a bit, you might know that I have this thing where I don't like notebooks with really dark dots. So the dot grid is something I really like to focus on when picking out a notebook. The second big thing I really like to think about is how big the notebook is. And I don't mean like the size, I mean how many pages it has and how many of these notebooks am I likely gonna need in a year. I personally love setting up a notebook at the beginning of the year. I think it's super fun, but what I don't love is having to reset up and migrate into new notebooks halfway a quarter of a ways or like a third through the year. If I could keep everything from an entire year in one notebook, that would be the ideal for me. So because of that, that is kind of the ideal I strive for when picking out a notebook. So with that in mind, I just try to kind of pick a notebook that satisfies, I guess, those two big things as much as possible. And for me this year, that was this notebook, which is the Stylogy 365-day A5 notebook in the dot grid. So if you look at this notebook, the first thing you might notice is that the dot grid is aggressively light. And then the second thing is this notebook, although he's not too chunky, here's my current bullet journal. Unlike this notebook, which has 208 pages, this has 368 pages. So I'm hoping that I'll fit a full year in this guy, but if I don't, it's not a big deal. It's all good. But at least I'll be able to be in this notebook for a really long time, which is what I like to do. I don't like to migrate a lot, guys. So I guess those were the two main factors when picking out a notebook. Someone asked in my Instagram poll for bullet journal migration questions how to pick a perfect notebook. And I think thinking about these things that I talked about really helps. I think knowing what you really don't like in a notebook helps, and knowing like what are your kind of must-haves versus wish list items. But also something that's important to know is that you're never going to find the perfect notebook. At least you might, but it's not likely. But you know what? At the end of the day, that's okay, because it's what you put in the notebook that really matters. I know that's like very warm and fuzzy, but you know, besides picking out a notebook, I also like to figure out what supplies I want to use in my bullet journal next year. And this question kind of goes along with the questions from people asking how to make the whole process less overwhelming. And essentially, I think one of the best ways to help reduce overwhelm with the bullet journal migration process is to, if you're going to be adding kind of different pens and collages and markers, creating a mood board before you go into your yearly setup will really help make the process a lot faster, a lot less stressful, and not as overwhelming. So the mood board, and kind of coming up with essentially a kind of place where you can write down the color palette you're going to use, the supplies you're going to use, other mediums you're going to use, and kind of get the visual story going down, is one way to reduce kind of overwhelm. And then the other way to reduce it, which we've kind of done already in these steps, is really getting in line with your purpose and figuring out your plan based on that purpose, so that, you know, you're making sure you're doing stuff with intention and you're really dedicating your time towards creating spreads that are going to really help you a lot. So now, to be honest, some years I like to get really funky and make like this elaborate mood board that's really visual and pretty. This year I just want to write down the supplies I'm going to use, because that's kind of the vibe I'm feeling this year. So that's what I'm gonna do. And this works just as well. You don't need to make elaborate looking mood boards if you don't want to. It really is doing what you need to get the job done so it works for you. And yeah, you'll probably notice that with my supply list, it's not that wild. I don't like to do any kind of art in my journal really, so that's why it's a little more simple. But I am trying to write things down I know I'll need based on the spreads I want to make. So like for my one photo a month, I'll need my Instax printer for that. So it's good to make sure I know that in advance, so I can check if I need to buy more Instax prints, because the answer is probably yes. And again, if you are making more like art in your journal, you can definitely get a bit more elaborate with this. Come up with a color palette, come up with maybe some sketches of like key elements you want to incorporate into your journal and carry over. But for me, I just find this works and it's pretty good. I also have a pretty kind of standard way of setting up spreads in my journal. So like and this will actually help with overwhelm as well. Having a kind of way of setting up spreads that you can carry over that doesn't require a lot of customization works really well. So for me, I always like to set up my spreads like this. I make a line, well, 2 lines with my ruler. I put my header up here in stamps, and then I put the content of my spread down here. And then I'll just add a line if I need a table or anything like that. But for the most part, it stays pretty simple. And I find that's a great way to make your setup a little faster too. It's just kind of having a consistent way of making spreads that you can carry over throughout the entire setup, and it'll just make your life a lot easier. The last thing I like to do before actually setting up my new bullet journal is figuring out how to enjoy my setup. For a long time, I made my setup process really rushed and unenjoyable, and it was not fun, and I really think that it should be a fun thing and that you should actually enjoy creating your new journal for the new year. So because of that, the last step is dedicated to writing down things like the playlist that you want to listen to while you set up your new journal, maybe the tea you want to drink if you're really busy. Noting down chunks of time you want to dedicate to setting up your bullet journal can also be a really great way to make sure that you know when you're going to be working on it and you have that time kind of set aside. Also, something to think about with planning your setup is really thinking about how much time you want to spend setting up your journal and how much time you ideally would like to spend, because I know some people don't like spending a lot of time setting up their bullet journal. I'm one of them. I don't love to spend a ton of time creating yearly setups, and I believe that you really can spend as much or as little time setting up your journal, and regardless of how much time you spend, it can still look really good if you want it to. So yeah, I think about that and then write down some ways that I can really make my entire setup session enjoyable and fun and relaxing and calming. All right, that is how I like to go about getting organized and prepping for my migration from my old journal into my new journal in a way that is not overwhelming. So I hope that this gave you a really good idea of exactly how I like to migrate in my process. And if you do want to follow my migration process, make sure to download the guide, which I will link below. It's completely free, and I really hope that it is helpful for you. So yeah, that's the video today. Best of luck to everyone setting up their journals for 2022. I will be posting my 2022 setup video next, so that'll be like a fun kind of follow-up video to this one. Until then, stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye, everybody.